And at that point I realized, oh shit, like I'm a drug addict. I have a problem.
Welcome to Investing in Sobriety, the podcast where we explore life, recovery, and the process of rebuilding from substance and process-based addictions. This is a space for real conversations, real experiences, and the transformations that happen when we truly invest in ourselves. For our first episode, I'm honored to introduce Charles Narwold. Charles was one of the first people I met outside of an institution while pursuing recovery almost 9 years ago. Growing up in the burbs of Connecticut, Charles went on to land at NYU, tour the world as a member of a well-known indie rock band, and work alongside a headlining comedian. But along the way, Charlie spiraled into hardcore addiction, losing opportunities, friendships, and nearly his life. His story doesn't end with zombie life on Skid Row, strung out on methamphetamine, or intubated in an ICU bed after a tragic car accident. In many ways, these moments were turning points. Charlie fought back. He asked for help, and he was able to rebuild his life, a life grounded in recovery. Today, he invests in real estate, co-founded Motoriot with his closest friend, and is in contract with a major production company for an unscripted reality TV show. Charlie's journey is raw, inspiring, and a testament that recovery isn't just about getting clean. It's about rebuilding, redefining, and thriving. It's about investing in your sobriety. Let's dive in. Just hit me with what's up in the life of Charles Narwold, sober individual. What's going?
Got it. So I'm 7.5 years sober. Today I live in Brooklyn, New York, right? I moved to New York City in 2006, so it's been almost 20 years in this city on and off. My life today, I started a business with my best friend 2 years ago. We import and customize classic trucks, right? So we're bringing in old Land Rovers, old Land Cruisers. We're customizing them at our shops in Madrid, and Pereira, Colombia, and putting them in containers, bringing them back to the States, right? Our headquarters is in Connecticut. That takes up a lot of my time. I'm a homeowner, man, dude, and this 12-step community is a big part of my life, right? I spend 8 months here in New York City, 4 months in Los Angeles. Life is good, man. Life is really good. 7.5 years ago, I was, in a sober living, working at the Abercrombie on Fifth Avenue, making minimum wage, just trying to figure out how, at 29 years old, I would claw my way back into some semblance of a real life, right? So the life I live today is beyond anything I could have ever imagined. I remember I was at a meeting once out in Los Angeles, and this guy Rob L, he shared. He said, and to the newcomer, he said, I hope you stick around, right? Because you just cannot possibly comprehend how good your life is going to get. You just can't, right? It'd be like conceptualizing what would it be like to be on the moon, right? You can see a photo of some guys on the moon, right? And you can think about, oh, that'd be kind of interesting, right? But you haven't been there. You don't know what that's like. And the reality is, unless you stick around long enough and stay on this journey, you just can't be there to see how good your life is going to get, right? So one day at a time, 1 month at a time, 1 year at a time, my life has slowly come back together, right? And I really appreciate that you brought up and shouted out, your sponsors, right? Because it wasn't me who figured this out, right? It wasn't like some grandiose concoction of my mind where I figured out how to claw my way back into some semblance of a real life, right? I tried that for years.
Right.
My mind tried to run the show, right? I'm going to do this instead of that. I'm going to live here instead of there. I'm going to hang out with these people instead of those people, right? None of that worked, right? I was having my mind try and just drive this, sinking ship, right? Yep. What really happened was I surrendered eventually, and I said, I give up, and I asked someone else for help. And that has been the story of the past 7.5 years, right? It's saying, I don't know, can you help me? And being around the right people, right, to kind of carry me to where I am today.
Absolutely. I can really relate to that. And, you'd hear people say, oh, sick and tired of being sick and tired and stuff like that. And what the heck are these people talking about? But there really comes this point where I I just believe even on a human base, it's like, man, this is not the path of least resistance, and it's painful. And then you have that recognition that you're creating all this chaos, and you're dragging everyone else in your life through this pain, right? 100%. It's literally the most selfish thing you can do, right? And yeah, so when you say that, I can remember moments that you had experienced. And just seeing the pain, for instance, like on your mom's face, you know, and we can get into that. But what I'd like to do is, I'd like to talk a little about like where you're from. Yeah. You know, it's cool that you're doing this. It's cool that you've had this recognition that you're doing what you need to do on a daily basis to get where you need to go. That you're helping other people. That you're involved. That you have community, camaraderie. You have a team, right? Yeah. And it wasn't always that way, right? I mean, where are you from?
Totally.
Right? Like, tell me a little about your childhood. Give me a quick snapshot of that.
You got it. Yeah, I'll be quick. I was born and raised in Connecticut, which is, I know where you're from as well. I grew up in West Hartford. And for a while, I'd tell you it was a pretty normal childhood.
Yeah.
Right? Because it was my experience, right? And it's what I knew as childhood. So, of course, it was normal, right? This was my experience. And, you know, from a very young age, I was like a super energetic kid. I remember in second grade, I, like a lot of kids from my generation, was like diagnosed with ADHD, right? And the idea was I was running around these classrooms and like hugging people. And I remember hugging my second grade teacher. And the answer to that was ADHD, right? And my mother, right, you know, she just, whatever, the doctors tell her I have ADHD, and so it goes. I get on this medication, and just this diagnosis is accepted, and you got this really kind of energetic and hyper kid, and now I'm medicated, right? And so I get into middle school and high school, right? And I'm not like Mr. Academic, and I'm not Mr. Athletic either, right? I'm kind of somewhere in between. And I start falling between the cracks at this school, right? And my dad, while he's a sweet guy, right, he wasn't really there, right? He was there, but he wasn't home, right? So I didn't really have an idea of what masculinity looked like, what a man looked like, how to talk with other men, how to look a man in the eye, right? None of this was like baseline for me. This was like a novelty, right? And so when I get to middle school and people are kind of pushing me around, well, I don't know how to push back, right? I don't know how to push back. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to be one of the guys in the locker room, right? So I ended up kind of just like, you know, making friends with whoever would have me. And I get to high school and the same deal. You know, it's just like all the things that were prioritized were the things I weren't really good at. So I didn't really know how to make friends, right? Because in the 2000s, right, you're in high school, well, if you don't like what's around you, you don't have like social media yet to kind of escape. Right. You don't have the TikTok and the Instagram. I can't like see that there are other ways of living out there, right? What is in front of me is my life. And I didn't fit in.
Yeah.
You know, I just didn't fit in.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I look at the time frame that we were in high school, pretty much the same period.
Yeah.
But for 4 to 5 years after us was, a cell phone era, right?
Totally.
We were like the last grip of individuals that were in high school, and cell phones were not normal, right?
Totally.
Like if you had a cell phone,
right.
maybe at some of these prep schools you had the kid that had a phone, but like it was not common. It was not common, right?
Yeah.
So I can understand how that.
There's no escapism outside of drugs and alcohol, right? You couldn't look at your phone and like, you know, watch porn or whatever it is. You know, it's just like, dude, like. I feel for these kids that are in high school today, man. It's just like...
They don't even have books. I talked to a teacher a couple days ago and up in Connecticut,
Totally.
And she said, yeah, we don't have books. And I was like, I didn't think about that. Now it's, a lot of my friends are having kids, but they're not in high school yet. Right. So I'm like, wow, it's kind of this aha moment.
Totally. It's like escapism seems to be you know, at least conceptually for me, it would seem that escapism in this scenario is a lot easier now. But, you know, maybe you know, anyway, right? So
even identifying with other people though too, right? Like I think you can, like you had pointed out, like you could find different outlets, right?
Yes.
And so a kid that's in a foreign country can identify with a kid that's in another country, right? Let alone a neighborhood or in the U.S. or whatever. So yeah, I find it really interesting because, you know, we were in the same town pretty much. I was away at boarding school, but I would come back and it was like, what's going on in West Hartford? Well, you're gonna, you know, somebody's going to go down to the north end or the south end. They're going to get the beers. They're going to come back. There's going to be some weed. You might drink at someone's house or you'll drink in the woods. You know, like, you know, it's pretty...
Yeah, no, totally, man. And what you described was like the high school experience that I was pretty much like left out of, right? You know, it was just like this idea of like listening to the Dave Matthews Band and like drinking in someone's basement or partying in the woods. And I just like didn't know how to relate to these kids.
Yep.
You know? And, you know, more than that, I just like didn't know how to talk to men.
You don't like Dave Matthews?
Yeah. I went to a Dave Matthews concert and I was like, am I like not understanding something here? But then I realized it's all about getting wasted in the parking lot and then you go see the music, right? So with that, I mean, you know, who wouldn't like that?
I don't remember many concerts in high school.
That's what I'm saying,
with you.
right? So, dude, it's like, you know, this is my upbringing, right? And, you know, I always say this, man, like, I ended up doing like more schoolwork in high school than I ever did in college, right? It was just like so intense, this school in Connecticut, man. And there was just like no outlet for me.
Yeah,
right?
Well, it's a very homogenized culture too.
So homogenized,
right?
Dude,
it's like not a lot of diversity at all, right?
Yeah,
and if like,
and
I don't even mean to be disrespectful because I played football, but like if there's a black kid there, it's probably because he plays sports.
No doubt.
Right? Like at least that's how it was. You know, we're getting old now, but like 15, 20 years ago, like there was probably an 80% probability that if there was a black kid at your school, it was because he was good at sports.
No doubt.
And that's just how it was, you know? So, yeah, I completely understand. You know, I know that there's people out there that probably understand. I say that because just talking with some of the guys that I went to high school with, having gone to different high schools, it seems like the substance abuse, at least in my mind, in my world, is a lot, like from a probability standpoint, there's a lot larger percentage of substance abusers that were in these private or boarding school environments. My experience. I don't know the data.
My therapist said the same thing, dude.
You know, it's interesting.
So
then you're in high school, and what's that transition out of high school? So I know that you ended up graduating, and then you end up in the city. So explain that transition and what, I mean, you go from West Hartford, Connecticut to New York City.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I had like discovered that my outlet in high school was like something creative, right? I had like a camcorder, so I was shooting and making movies, and I thought to myself, well, I have to go to college, right? So I'll apply to NYU and see if I can get into the film program. Ended up like, you know, getting creative with how I passed the SATs, and got a better score than I should have as a result, and ended up, you know, getting accepted to NYU. And sure enough, fall 2006, I moved into a dorm on Washington Square Park South, or Washington Square Park West. And like that, my life was changed, right? We go from this homogenized culture in West Hartford, Connecticut, to, you know, like living in a dorm in downtown Manhattan. And suddenly, you know, I saw, I mean, this is like, it's gonna sound like cliche, right? Because this is like what happens when people talk about like moving to New York City, but this also was my experience, was that I went from like having like one flavor of ice cream to having the entire world.
So what was that process like? So you show up, you realize that this is a buffet of personalities and cultures.
Yeah.
I mean, having traveled all over the world, and I know you're doing a lot of traveling, there's no city like New York City.
Yeah, there's no city like New York.
There is not. At least I haven't been there. So what was that process like for you as you're kind of discovering yourself, but realizing maybe more so what you are not, right?
Totally, yeah, so there's like two parts to that. Part one is like, I'm still trying to figure out how to like make friends, and specifically make friends with men, right? and concurrently like figure out who I am, right? So there's the art portion, but there's also, I ended up at like a fraternity party by accident that first week in college, right? And I end up kind of like accidentally pledging a fraternity, right? And it was one of these like crazy like, hazing process and a lot of drinking. But what I realized is that, the crazier I was or the more I drank, like the more attention I got from men. And I kind of used that as a way to make friends.
Okay. And there's no inhibitions, right?
Like, no inhibitions, right?
Right. It's like, if that's a switch, it's like 4 beers,
I can't remember if it was this arm or this arm, but I had a guy like light a broom on fire and put it out on my arm, and I have a hole in my arm to this day, right? And it's just like, that is the type of stuff I liked to do because I was the center of attention, right? And I wanted the attention, and I wanted people to look at me, and I wanted people to like validate my existence in that room. On the other side of that, right, NYU was an awesome experience, right? And the professors were amazing, but really to me, it wasn't about the college, right? It was about the opportunity to move to New York City at 18, right? Because it wasn't like the college that really like blew open my creative world and like, led to, playing in a band and going on tour and traveling the world, right? The college didn't do that. It was like being exposed to creative people, DIY folks, like doing cool and exciting things, right? And like the one thing that's been true throughout my entire life, and I think I can attribute a lot of my success being constantly inspired by people who are doing cool things and like finding people who are excited about their thing and like learning more about it, right? And using that as like a match of sorts that kind of just ignites this creativity, right? And so for me, it was about like surrounding myself with people who were like, opening DIY venues in Brooklyn or like throwing shows or throwing parties or whatnot. And that's kind of what got me out of the world of film and TV, where I felt kind of intimidated and I wasn't sure, what was going on, and into playing music, right? I'd played guitar since I was 5 years old, and that was one of the things that my mom kind of like shoved down my throat, right? Was play guitar, play bass, do this, do that, and like sure enough, I'm 22 years old now, and I'm graduating school, and I'm like, dude, I have to get a job, and I work all these kind of like soul-sucking positions of like being at a talent agency, submitting people's portfolios for like commercial roles, being at an infomercial production company, right, selling fitness products, right, and like being an office PA there. And I was like, dude, like, there's got to be like something that's a little more creatively fulfilling, right? And that's when I was like, you know what? Well, if there's ever a time to do it, like I'm gonna pick my guitar back up, and I'm gonna see, I'm gonna see if I can figure this out and start playing shows. And that's when like life really changed. Yeah. That's when life really changed for me.
Well, I think it's funny that you mentioned I'm gonna pick my guitar back up and start playing shows because I know you were in a band for a while, right, and you were traveling, and I didn't know that aspect that your mom said that, because I know your dad's a music head too.
Yeah. I remember seeing an ad on like Facebook, like some guy looking for a guitarist in his band, right? And I listened to the music. It's in French, right? It's like a cold wave band, which is kind of like, Joy Division, The Cure, kind of that 80s post-punk, new wave, synth wave, right? Okay. And I said, well, dude, I don't care. Like, I just want to play music, right?
Was it in French?
Yeah, it was in French. It was in French. The music was in French. I did not understand the lyrics, right?
Okay.
But like, I reached out to this guy, and he's out in a warehouse in Bushwick, and I was like, cool. I lived in Manhattan at the time. It was around 2011. I get out there, and we play music, and we're in his loft, and he's like, yeah, we got a show in downtown Manhattan in like 3 weeks, and I was just like, all right, I think I can do this, right? And we play our first show at Home Sweet Home, which is in downtown Manhattan. The band was called Frank, Just Frank, and we show up to this venue. It's like 2011, Home Sweet Home. It's Wednesday night, and the party is called Weird, but the E and the I are switched in Weird, right? And
that's weird.
Yeah, weird. We go downstairs, and everyone is in all black. Looks like they just like shot dope in the bathroom, like eyeliner, and it's a mix of like gothic, industrial. I mean, it's it's like something you'd see out of a movie, right? At least for me. And I'm walking in, a kid who had graduated NYU a year earlier, and I'm looking at all these people, and I'm like, holy shit, man! Like, there's this whole subculture that I just like didn't know existed and was never exposed to, right? And that's been my experience with New York too. Is like, if you have your thing, some other people share that thing, and you can get sucked into a subculture and only do that for 3 years, and you know, never, you know, you don't even have to focus on anything else, right? And so suddenly I get sucked into this like underground, post-punk, new wave, gothic industrial party that's like, you know, every Wednesday night in downtown Manhattan, and we start playing shows around New York City. And suddenly, like, I'm in a band. It's not a very big band, but it's a band nonetheless. And I can say, all right, well, cool. I'm a musician in New York City, and I feel good about it. And it felt fulfilling. It felt like cool. It's like the way I wanted to kind of see myself.
You're on stage.
I'm on stage, man. Right? I'm on stage, dude. I finally like have the attention. I don't have to fight for my attention. Like now.
Are you using then now? Are you using?
Yeah.
Where are you with substance abuse? Right.
So I kind of alluded to, like in college, it was a lot of drinking, man, which I don't think is that unique, right? Like a lot of people drink a lot in school, right? Where I kind of felt different was that I would kind of keep pushing it.
Yeah.
And I would end up hurting myself, hurting someone else, breaking something, right? And just keep trying to get to that next level, right? Because that's how I got your attention, man. Right. And I loved that. You know, I really loved that. You know, and like a lot of our kids in our generation, man, you know, I'm 36. You know, I had a buddy whose like dad had an OxyContin prescription, right? I didn't know what the fuck that was, dude. I was just like, I never like set out when I was young, like, you know, I'm gonna do pills, or I'm gonna like, you know, I just like drank and maybe occasionally did some blow, but like, you know, it was never, I didn't like think about all the other drugs that were out there, right? Just wasn't on my radar.
Yeah.
But one day my buddy comes and he's got this, you know, this green pill with an 80 on it.
Yeah.
And he's like, you know, this is my dad's back painkiller. I was like, all right. I mean, like, dude, I'm just not even thinking about it. Whatever. All right, whatever, dude. Like,
yeah.
you know,
Let's do it.
Yeah, well, cool, I guess. Like, right? Chop it up, do a small amount. And I'm like, all right. Well, this is pretty cool. And, you know, I didn't think much of it. And, you know, one night in a drunken stupor, I'm walking down Chinatown and I, you know, I kick a box because, you know, I like to kick and break things. And I kick this box, I slip, and I land on my elbow. You can see the scar here, right? I completely shattered my elbow. And whatever, I wake up the next day, my elbow's like the size of a balloon. I can't move. Go to the hospital. It turns out it's broken. They put a screw in my elbow, and they send me home. And they send me home with a bottle of pills. And I don't think much of it, man, because again, this is not on my radar. But I remember sitting in my bed in the East Village. I was on Avenue C in 4th Street. I had this apartment. It was like 2008 or 9. And I'm sitting there, and I put on this movie, Sweeney Todd, which by all accounts, not a movie I was like super interested in. But I'd had a few of these pills, and I had a few PBRs, and I felt amazing. And I just didn't put it together, man. I didn't like, you know, I didn't think about what was happening. What I thought was, this movie is amazing. And then I thought about it more, and I was like, dude, this movie sucks. I just feel really good. And that was the first time I can remember this like feeling of like, just that warm blanket, you know? And that was a start for me, man. It was Percocet. You know, there were some Percocets. But at some point, you know, and I can't remember exactly when, it became like the most important thing that I look forward to, right? And even though I was only maybe doing it once or twice a week, that was the part of my week that I really cared about. You know, senior year of NYU, you know, my buddy goes, hey man, these pills are getting kind of expensive. You know, heroin is the same thing. And I didn't know that, right? He's like, you know, heroin's the same thing. I was like, well, no, actually, I don't know that, Dave, dude. You know, I don't think about this stuff.
Opiate or opioid?
Yeah, right. Okay. I'm like, all right, well, dude, if you say so, you know, now where do we get that? You know, like, I was just like, I'm not like, dude, okay. And you know, sure enough, I reached out to you know, Lady Eve, who was hooking us up, and I said, hey, you think you can get some brown for us? And you know, and because I didn't know what to call it, you know, and she was like, brown? She was, you mean like dope? And I was like, yeah, I think so. Is that what you mean, heroin? She was like, yeah, I got you. It's bags? You know, it was like this whole kind of like thing of trying to figure out what to call it.
Right.
And it shows up, right? And Dave and I are looking at it, and we're just like, and I'm holding it, and I'm like, dude, can I get on the subway with this? Are we gonna get arrested? You know, he was like, come on, let's go to my place in Williamsburg. And he lived on the water there in a warehouse. And I remember sniffing this stuff for the first time. And like big shock, it felt the same as Oxycontin. Same thing, right? But I was just like, God damn it. Like, and I knew then and there, man, I was just like, this is something I'm gonna keep doing.
So when you're playing the music, are you getting high too? Because personally, I had a difficult time ever making that transition. I became so fixated on the actual pill. Like it was weird, ritualized. And you talk a little about that ritualization, right? Oh, this is the 1 or 2 days. This is my going to church moment of the week, right?
Yes.
Sunday, we're going to church.
Yeah, dude.
You know,
we call it flying first class.
Okay.
You're flying first class. Dude.
You had a name.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
Yeah,
so yes, this is carved out in the week, and it is something
dude.
that's ritualized.
You flying, dude? Yeah. So yeah, but by the time I graduated at NYU and started playing music, I was using every couple of days, right? And I had these, odd production jobs, just like trying to find my way and like make money and also like be around a camera, right? And then I had like this creative pursuit of like playing music at night. I'm using every couple of days. I got my running buddies, right? But what I'm also realizing is like, the friends that I'm keeping at this point in my life are the friends who party like I do.
Right.
And it's not like intentional, dude. I'm not like going out and like looking to make friends of people who are like, snorting pills, but like suddenly, my college buddies who just like drink on the weekend or have girlfriends, well, they kind of slowly start to fade out, right? And my family in the other state, well, I'm not really talking to them that much. Suddenly, I meet this guy named Johnny Pierce, and Johnny was a lead singer and is the lead singer of this band called The Drums. Like, Johnny kind of alludes to the fact, he's like, hey man, like our guitarist just quit, so we're kind of looking for a new guitarist right now. And I thought to myself, well, dude, I could play guitar. And so I thought it, and I said it. I said, Johnny, dude, you've seen me play. You've been at one of my shows. I know you saw Plastic Flowers play. You know I can play guitar. He said, well, cool. We're going on a UK, Japan tour. When we come back to the US, we're going to need someone. I hear from Johnny a few weeks later, and he's like, hey, listen, man, I really appreciate that you learned the parts, but I hate to tell you, like, the guy who's playing with us in the UK, he's going to come with us back to the US. We actually don't need you anymore. And I was crushed, dude, because like suddenly after hearing that, my whole like life trajectory was like playing in this band, going around the world, and like being a rock star, right? And that all kind of came to a crash. Yeah. And I sat there and I was like, all right, so now I can go back to, catering, playing in this, band here, like this local band here in New York City and figuring it out. And I was bummed. And a few days later, I get another phone call from Johnny. And it's the day before their US tour. And he says, hey man, our guitarist didn't make it through customs. You still interested in coming on tour? I was like, yeah. He was like, cool, meet us tomorrow at 9 a.m. at 14th and 1st. And we got a warm-up show at Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. And then we're doing a US tour, and we need someone to come with us. And like that, man, overnight, my life changed. And I remember that morning before going to meet the rest of the band, who I'd never met, by the way, right? I put a needle in my arm, shot up, and went to go meet the rest of the band.
Like a good addict.
Like a good addict, dude, right? And like the most important thing, right? Like my dream job has now presented itself. But dude, I got 3 bags of dope in my place, man, and I'm not gonna go to Pennsylvania without getting high first.
Right.
And what was really interesting was that first night, after that show at Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania, which was like a sober show, the other guitarist looks at me and he goes, I'm on to you, motherfucker. And I was like, what is he talking about? He's like, I can see your eyes are pinned. And I was like, oh my God, he's gonna rat me out. But that became my running buddy, man.
Yeah.
That became my running buddy. And that was the only other guy in the band who understood where I was at and used like I used, right? And so not only did like the dream job kind of end up in my lap, kind of accidentally, right? I never set out to be a musician in this way. It just kind of fell into my lap. But I had a running buddy. And that next day we were getting high at a spot in Park Slope. It was kind of one of these things where like everything I had thought that I always wanted came true, right? Like I was able to pay my rent playing music. I was able to travel the world on the dime of someone else. I was able to play guitar professionally.
Yeah.
But like none of it was ever more important than getting high.
What was going on inside of you, like internally during this, phase or this life-changing moment, opportunity inside of you?
It's a great question, and it's like, it's tough to answer. But if I had to really kind of put myself back to where I was at that point in time, I think I really wanted to feel like I had value, and that I was bringing something to the table, and that I deserved my seat. I felt like this gave me a personality because I don't think I really knew who I was. So when it was like putting on a mask, right? I had the long greasy hair, the leather jacket, the ripped up vintage band tee, the guitar, right? And suddenly I could say, well, this is me. This is who I am. I'm a musician and I play music. And like I stepped into this mask and that mask became me. This wasn't built on anything. I was like just jumping from one hedonic pleasure to the next, like a bag kind of just blowing in the wind, right? I would see, oh, there's a really cute girl, or here's a drug, or here's the show, or here's this travel opportunity, or this or that. But there was nothing, it was built on nothing. Because I don't think at the core I really had an idea of who I was, and I was still looking to the outside to tell me what I was worth and to tell me who I was inside.
I completely understand that. That resonates with me. I think that there's a lot of people that have that feeling. As you're living in this place of identifying your seat at the table or
Right.
Your identity,
Right.
You're also fear-based, right? Because you don't want to lose this.
Totally.
But you do. So give the listeners a quick rundown of like what happened with the drums.
As I was like living this like what felt like a dream job, I was coming to grips with the fact that I was like a heavy substance user. And I remember a year or two earlier, I had gotten high, and a day later I felt terrible. I felt really sick, and I was in a bathtub and I couldn't figure it out. And it dawned on me, and I said, holy shit, this is what withdrawal, I'm in withdrawal from heroin right now. Right? Because it's like you never think you're gonna get to that point, right? No one sets out to party and get high and thinks about what's actually gonna happen when you come down. Right? And I did, and I came down. And at that point I realized, oh shit, like I'm a drug addict. I have a problem. I am a drug addict. And that came to me in like 2011.
Okay.
Right? 2011. 2013, I'm playing in this band. I've got this job, and I'm also now like managing an active drug addiction. And I end up in an outpatient rehab for the first time in 2013, concurrently while I'm playing with the drums.
Okay.
Right? And it's called the Realization Center. It's in Union Square in New York City. And I remember telling my mom, at Christmas the year before, I said, Mom, I got a problem with some stuff, but it's cool. I'm going to, take care of it. I'm going to go to this program. And, I was very vague, right? Because I want to say this too. I felt so much shame around what I was doing. I felt so much shame.
Why? Because I felt the same thing. So I don't mean to throw you on the spot, but
no.
I felt a deep sense of shame. Like,
dude,
this is not me.
Totally.
This isn't me. Like, I'm better than this.
Yeah, I felt a lot of shame because I didn't know who I could talk. You can't, once you have a heroin addiction, you can't really talk to anyone about it, was my thinking at the time. I said, what am I going to do? Who's going to understand what I'm going? And I had everything going for me. I had all of the support, and I had this pretty privileged upbringing, right? I went to by all accounts, like a good school, and suddenly I've got this monkey on my back I can't shake.
Yep.
And it's the most important thing to me. Actually, nothing is as important. And I had to lie about it because I didn't want to be seen as a heroin addict. Who does, right? No one wants to. It's not something I want associated with me, right? So I lie to my friends and I tell them it's morphine, or Oxycontin, and I would lie to people so they would get high with me, because I'd say this brown powder is something else, and then I'd have them do it with me because I didn't want to be alone. But I also had too much pride, and I felt so much shame around it that I couldn't be honest. And even when people confronted me about it, you know, I clammed up. You know, I just couldn't talk about it, because talking about it is accepting that it's real, right? And I would not do that. I would not. If you said you have a problem with heroin, I'd say, what are you talking about? Right? What are you talking about? I like to party. But as soon as I give it back to you and say, you're right, I'm acknowledging that it's a problem, and I'm acknowledging that it's real. And I just never did that, right? And so when I go to this rehab, right?
The realization center?
The realization center, right?
Okay, so you have a you're at the realization center.
It's covered by my insurance, right? It wasn't you know, it's like this logical thing in my mind. You know what? I'll just I'll go to this thing for a few weeks. I'm still gonna drink, but I'm gonna, stop doing dope, and that's gonna turn my life around, and I'll get the monkey off my back, and then I'll go back to life as normal, right? That was my thinking. You just go. It's like a boo-boo. You go to a doctor and he fixes it, and then you go back to living, right? Yeah. That's how I saw it, right? So I'm gonna go to this 8-week outpatient program. Everything's gonna be okay. I'm gonna drink, and we'll be fine. It's not how it went for me. They suggested that I go to AA meetings, right? And they suggested that I stop drinking. They suggested that I got off all substances, and I just wasn't ready to hear that. And I remember my counselor at the time, this guy I'm still good friends with today, actually. And I remember he was like, he was in a button-down suit, but he was all tatted up, and he said, why do you think you like doing heroin? Why do you do heroin? And I thought about it. I was like, well, this is kind of a silly question. Because it's like fun, because this is what I do, because I enjoy it. What do you think? It's just like, right? Someone asks you that, that's my answer. It's my hobby.
Right.
It's my life. It's what brings me joy. But that's genuinely how I felt at the time. And we can get to that down the line. But that was my mindset at the time, right? And I didn't look any deeper. It was fun, and I liked to party. And sure enough, I ride that train all the way to, getting fired from my dream job, right? We get off a tour after going to Slovakia and Kuala Lumpur and Sicily and just all this stuff. Dude, you can't even believe. And I get an email that was just like, yeah, you're not coming on the next tour with us. And it's the end of 2013. And again, I felt so much shame. I said, well, I can't tell anyone about this. This is my whole personality.
Yeah.
This is how people know me. This is how I know myself. And without this, who am I? I'm just a guy.
Well, it's interesting because right. But as you're building this personality, right? Or as your identity, right? Your group, your substance abuse is tearing that away, right? Yeah. So it's like you go out there, you're Charles Narwold, you're jamming out on stage, traveling around the world, super cool, meeting a bunch of different people, chicks, whatever you got going on out there in the world, which is, awesome, right? Playing music, who doesn't want to have a job that they love, right? And meanwhile, you have this substance abuse problem that's slowly ripping that away as you're trying to build it, right? So you end up no longer with the band.
Yeah.
And how do you scrap yourself together? Where's your head? What are you feeling? What year? So we're in 2013. Yeah. What's going on?
Yeah, so that was the end of 2013. And I'll circle back to what I was saying. I was so scared of just losing this job, right? And then I lost the job. I was so scared of what you would think of me without that, right? And I think so much of my headspace at the time was I needed to be doing something to be seen as having value in your eyes, right? I needed to have accomplished something. I needed to be on stage. I needed to have a cool job. I needed to have a cool apartment. I needed to be dressed a certain way so that you would understand that, like, I'm the guy. There was just this, like, fear of just, like, are you going to like me if I'm just a regular person, you know? Let alone a heroin addict.
Right.
You know?
Okay.
Let alone a heroin addict. And so sure enough, like I go back to this, apartment with 7 bedrooms and 14 people in Bushwick and a loft and the room with no windows. And now I don't have a job, right? And I don't tell anyone I got kicked out of the band because I was just like, well, no one needs to know until they go back on tour and I'm not there, buy me some time to find some other cool job.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, dude, I gotta just like stay on tour. I gotta stay on tour. I don't want to be home. I want to just keep going and going and going. And
right.
I get connected with this guy Ralphie May, who's no longer with us. Yeah. But he, had just come off winning Last Comic Standing and was, pretty big name in comedy at that point in time. And he needed a tour manager and like right place, right time. He asked me if I, live in Los Angeles. I don't. I lie. I say I do. I move into my best friend's walk-in closet in Santa Clarita.
Okay. Put
an inflatable mattress, and suddenly I'm working for Ralphie. And it's funny, that guy whose walk-in closet I moved into, he's now my business partner.
Okay.
10 years later. But so the job with Ralphie starts, and I'm living out of a tour bus with his face on the side of it that said, "Ralphie May is coming your way."
So for the listeners that don't know who Ralphie May is or was, Ralphie May was an up-and-coming comedian. Sad reality is Ralphie May is no longer with us, but he was putting on some big shows around the time where you connected with him. Like he was one of the top comedians in the community at that point.
So I'm living on a bus with this guy, and we're driving around the U.S., and dude, like, talk about imposter syndrome. I felt like I wasn't qualified for the job. And the reality was I probably wasn't, like I'm just like some like 24, 25-year-old kid who's never tour managed anyone before. And now I'm going out with one of the biggest comics in the US, and I'd kind of like backed my way into this job with a decent resume. And sure enough, like I'm also figuring out how to get high in every city we're going to. And Ralphie's not an idiot, man. Ralphie had his own demons too, and it was this elaborate dance because his wife was his manager, and I kind of had to balance between Ralphie and his wife, and I was often in between, and the reality was, man, after a few months, I got kicked to the curb from that job as well. Dude, I had moved across the country for this job, so now I'm like in Jason walk-in closet in Santa Clarita. I got all my stuff, an inflatable mattress. I'm not paying rent. And I'm like 45 minutes north of Los Angeles, and I'm just like, what am I doing, dude? I think something I was excited about moving to LA because I thought this is really great. I don't know any dealers, right? I don't have, I don't know how I'm gonna get high, right? But the reality is, man, you put off that energy. And I remember the first social event I went to in Los Angeles, I'd smoked some black tar, which is, heroin, and I walk out of the bathroom and someone sees a little smudge of black on my face. And that was just enough for that guy to come up to me and swap numbers. And sure enough, 3 days into being in Los Angeles, I got a guy who's like sliding me a Klonopin, who's got a tar connection, and all because he just saw this little mark, right?
Yeah.
I thought I was so sly getting high in the bathroom. But that's just how it went, man. And like I talked about earlier, all your friends I'll speak for myself, all my friends from my previous life, right? Friendships are like plants. You gotta like water the plant, right? You gotta put some effort in, right? It's not like, I think at the time I thought because I was a nice guy that I was a good person. But what I realized was I wasn't taking the steps to maintain friendships. So as a result, everyone kind of pushed away. Right, and the only people I had in my life at this time, right, I'd been fired from Ralphie, it was 2014, I was living in Los Angeles, were the guys I got high with. This is when things really kind of went off the rails, man. I moved into a cheap apartment in Highland Park, and I started driving for Lyft and Uber, which was like, dude, pretty easy to kind of sign up for and make some money, and that was how I made money, and Dude, I was a full-blown junkie at that time. I mean, you know, Los Angeles was not good for me. I didn't have many friends. The only people that were my friends I was getting high with. I got in with like some you know, crust punks who hung out in the back of like an old movie prop store in Hollywood. The front of the store was like old VHS tapes and props from 80s movies, and the back was just like this couch and a TV where they'd put in a VHS tape, and everyone was strung out, dude. And it was like something out of a movie, and it was, you know, it was my life. And you know, I remember, you know, finding a quack doctor out there, getting a Xanax prescription, dude, and I was just like, dude, I am really in over my head right now. And I started thinking about, how can I back out, right? How do I get out of this situation? And this is where the mind comes in and tells you what you can do, right? The mind says, well, maybe you only do heroin on the weekend, you'll do Xanax during the week, right? Or, you know, maybe if you get in the methadone program, you can slowly wean yourself off the opiates, and then you'll just be good. You know, you just stop doing them, and you won't have to go through the withdrawal process. And, you know, sure enough, that's what I said. Okay, well, I'll get on the methadone program, and I sign up, and I show up, and the clinic is in South Central, and I'm like the only guy who looks like me there, you know, and I look like a mess at the time. I was like 40 pounds less than I am now. I was not showering. I was wearing a leather jacket. I looked like a skeleton, man.
That's what I was gonna say.
I looked like a skeleton. Yeah, dude,
Skeletor walking.
Yeah,
out.
dude. It was just like people would look at me on the street. I remember one guy just cold approached me and just said, "Gross, dude. Stop." You know, like I'll never forget that. Just on the streets of downtown Los Angeles, someone said, "Dude, stop." You know, and I'll never forget that. You know, and so now I'm driving to South Central every day, and you know, I'm on the methadone program, and I really thought to myself, I was like, this will be good, because I can just kind of wean off, and then I'll be off the opiates, and you know, I'll just, you know, that'll be it. It didn't work like that, man. You know, the thing is, like, a methadone clinic isn't really a place to get sober, is what I realized. Exponentially continued to get worse. This was like 2014, 2015. So now it was a mix of, you know, heroin, meth, benzodiazepines, and I had no life anymore. It was just kind of in a spiral, man. You know, I was looking for any sort of handout I could. I signed up for food stamps. I just like couldn't hold a job, and at some point, man, I didn't know what to do. And things kind of came to a head when I started hearing voices, you know, and I realized now that this was like an amphetamine-induced psychosis. But at the time, man, you know, I thought I had like a computer chip in my brain. I thought cameras were following me. I thought, I really had lost a grip on reality, and I had no one to talk to about it, and my life had become so small. I didn't talk to my friends in New York. I didn't really talk to my family. I didn't have friends in Los Angeles, and I didn't have friends in general, because the way I used and the way I lived my life, I just couldn't relate to anyone else. So things kind of came to a head. My family hadn't heard from me in a few weeks. I had lost my car. Like, I just misplaced it. You know, one day I couldn't find where my car went, you know, and I found it a few weeks later in an impound lot, and I just didn't have the money to get it out. So I was getting around in the public bus, and one day my dad just showed up, and he picked me up off the street. I was Airbnb-ing my apartment because it was the only way I could, like, make some money to pay for my habit. I was sleeping on friends' couches. You know, my dad, we left all of my stuff at the apartment. He put me on an airplane. We went back to the East Coast. And that was 2015. It was like summer 2015. And at that point, I had no job, no money, credit card debt. I was on methadone, physically addicted to methadone, physically addicted to benzodiazepines. And suddenly I was back in my childhood bedroom. And, you know, I was going to the north end of Hartford every day to get methadone. And, you know, I didn't know what to do or where to go. And my mom would find like needles in my pants, and I told her I had diabetes, all this crazy stuff, dude, that just like, you know, my life was so small, man. And my mental health was so poor. I ended up in the psych ward once or twice, and like at Hartford Hospital. It was just bad, man. My parents were scared. I had no friends at that point. And one day, you know, my mom suggests I go to a 12-step meeting which I did. And, you know, that opened my life up a bit because I started making friends, right? And you and I met.
That's where we met.
That's where we met, right? We were going to meetings. And, you know, it wasn't this thing that, like, changed my life immediately. Like, what it did for me was give me friends, and it got me out of my house. And I would go to meetings, and I would put time in between using, but I was still the same guy. You know, even if I had 2 months sober, it was just a question of when I was going to use again, because there was no, like, spiritual or psychic change. There was no moat being built. There was no foundation being built. I just, like, made some friends who were sober or trying to get sober, and that was cool. You know, I didn't work a 12-step program. I went to a 12-step meeting and I didn't do the 12 steps. So what I was just a guy sitting in the back of the room waiting to use again, and occasionally I'd use in that room too.
Well, in all fairness, I will say this, not to discredit you, but you did do a few of the steps.
Yeah.
And because you would pick me up, there were several times where you'd pick me up and bring me to a meeting.
Yeah.
And I think you could admit that you had a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. I had a problem.
And you were helping.
So step one was done. Yeah.
And you helped me out. But no, I completely understand. You were just filling a seat.
It's filling a seat, dude. And it was like a way to get out of this bedroom that I was living in, and a way to get out of this really dark headspace, which was just like, I'm 26. I had this great life. I burnt it to the ground. I now live with my parents. I have no autonomy over my life. I might as well be a child. I am a child. I haven't grown up.
Right.
I don't know who I am. I can't control myself. I can't control what I do. But at least I got you guys, right? And I felt good in that sense. But I was still running away from myself. You know, that's a big part of my story, is like, you know, running away from me. You know, and I get in this bad car accident, you know, and I just, you know, and quite honestly, you know, I just didn't see a way out, you know, and I thought that maybe this would be the way out, you know, and it wasn't, and I ended up in a hospital, with a tube in my chest, I had a trach, a tube in my stomach. And I was in the hospital for a month, right? And it was this whole thing, Derek, of I don't know how to get away from myself. I don't know how to get out of the space I'm in. I don't see a path forward. This has to be the easiest way to go. And it wasn't. And I end up in this hospital. And you are standing next to me, and my mom is there, and my dad is there, and I can't walk. And they think I have a traumatic brain injury. And I'm bedridden for a month. And I start seeing some friends from the 12-step meeting come in, and I just don't, you know, talk about it that much because it's just so, like, it's so far removed from where I am today. But it was a really, really dark time, man. You know, and the first thing I did when I had to go to, like, a physical rehab after that was, like, sneak a crack pipe in. You know, it doesn't matter how bad it got for me, man. This was my solution to get out of myself, right? Right? It was the easiest way for me to not be with myself, even if it was just for 15 minutes.
Even if you're in the hospital bed and I'm bringing in nicotine or dip for you.
Dude, was that what it was? You were bringing in like dip tobacco so I could numb out in the hospital bed. Yeah, me either.
You're like, hey, bring in a tin. I'm like, I got you.
Dude. Good man.
Hey,
dude, yeah.
I thought you were going to be dead. You know, a little nicotine, but I didn't realize. You did a really good job. Well, relative. But like you did a really good job at rallying the people behind you and keeping this faith that, yeah, I got this, right? That I'm going to do this, right? And I don't know.
What do you mean by I don't even remember.
Well, you have a personality that people. I don't know a lot of people that don't like you. Let's say that, right? You're very personable and you're a nice guy, right? You're in rehab, physical rehab, because
Yeah, right.
because
I think I have a TBI.
Yeah, you have a TBI. You have holes in your neck. Your face reconstructive surgery, like serious
I
shit.
A plate in my face.
This isn't just like I got in a car accident. No, you were borderline dead.
Yeah.
That was a conversation I remember having with your family. Your mom, it was brief, but she was very direct to the level of seriousness that I was about to experience prior to seeing you. So yeah, you're in physical rehab. You're sneaking in crack pipes like the good addict you are.
This is the only way, man.
And what's going on? Where are you located geographically? Where are you mentally? What are you feeling?
Now I'm just worse off than I was before.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You got a feeding tube, I think so.
I got a feeding tube, and I got a scar in my neck, and my grandmother has just passed away, and I'm like, dude, it's just like, it just gets worse and worse, man. I can't shake it. And I turned to the dark web, man. I remember looking for ways to end my life peacefully. I remember I still have this PDF on my computer called The Peaceful Pill about a way to end my life. That was what I saw was the way out, was killing myself. And that or getting high. And I turned to the dark web. I ordered a sizable amount of crystal meth, and it gets sent to my parents' house. And at that point, my parents are so scared that they're paying my friends to watch me because they did not trust myself being alone. And I go upstairs with this giant bag. I rip it out on my counter, and I'm looking at it like Scarface. And my mom walks into the bathroom, and again, it's that shame. I was like, I can't tell my mom this is. She's like, what is this? And I can't tell her it's crystal meth. This sounds insane, And so I was like, it's, methamphetamine. And she goes downstairs, dumps it in the sink. My friends are watching it all happen. And she looks at me and she says, all right, you got two options. You can go back to being on the street and just figure it out, right? Or you can go to treatment, but you can't be here anymore. You just can't. And you need to do this this week. Right? You can't stay here anymore and do what you're doing. Because it's not affecting you, it's affecting everyone. And I don't want to be a part of it anymore. And that was it. That was my sober date. And, a day later, my dad is driving me to a state-funded rehab facility in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I remember walking into that facility, and it was February of 2017. And it's freezing. And I walk in and I watch someone get punched in the face in the first 5 minutes and taken away. And I was just like, gee, it was like, the 5th floor of a 6th floor building, and everyone there is court mandated or coming out of prison. And I'm just walking in with a copy of Harry Potter, just trying to escape from reality any way I know how, right? And this was my best thought. I was like, I don't have drugs anymore. I'm just going to read Harry Potter. And I was there for a month and a half. And then I was like, well, now what? Now do I just go back to my parents' house or something and have the same problem that I've had for the past 2 years? And they're like, no, you're going to another rehab. And so I head over to Silver Hill in New Canaan, Connecticut. And, because I was dealing with mental health issues as a result of amphetamines, I go to a dual diagnosis program, right? And I'm heavily medicated for psychoses at this point. And I do another 45 days at Silver Hill. And it comes time to go. And I'm like, well, geez, what happens now? Do I go back to my parents' house? I'm 3 months sober at this point, right? The drugs are out of my system. I can't go back to where I was. I'm not going to get a job in West Hartford. I have no skills at this point. I've been unemployed for a few years. I've burnt every bridge in the music industry. I've burnt all the bridges I had with anyone in college. So what now? And the clinician in Silver Hill is like, well, you know what? There's this sober living I can send you to in New York City. And I was like, well, what's that? And it's like, well, everyone who lives there is sober, and you get drug tested, and you go to an outpatient program. They suggest you go to some 12-step meetings, and what I heard was you can go to New York City. And sure enough, I get picked up, and in May of 2017, I'm living in a house with 16 dudes in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And, I really, really started what I would consider my journey of recovery.
What does the beginning of this phase of your journey, right? Because you were going to some 12-step meetings, but one foot in the door, one definitely out. But this new New York City transition, post these programs, what's the design of your day-to-day look like? What's the design of putting your life together look like? Meeting people? What's, coming back to the buffet of New York City, what's going on in the mind of Charles Narwold?
Honestly, I kept my life really small, in a sense. Like, for New York City, it was small, right? And for that first year of being back in New York, right, where, like you said, it's a buffet and you can do literally anything, meet anyone, spend your time anywhere, 24 hours a day, I had an outpatient program, I had a therapist, and I went to 12-step meetings. And I was terrified of being alone, right? I hated being alone with my own thoughts because my mind was still a really scary place for me. Because there were voices in my head, but my mind had also, led me into all this crazy stuff from the years before, right? Had rationalized doing this drug or doing this or that. And so it was terrifying being alone. So what I did was I spent as much time with other people as I possibly could. And I like being in that sober living because it was the first time I felt like I was moving towards something. And, in a couple of years, I didn't know where I was going. I couldn't really conceptualize where I was going, and that's okay. It's totally okay. I just knew that I was putting some time together and that I was sober and that I had a job. I was like working at the Abercrombie on Fifth Avenue, and I didn't really think a ton about the future. It was really kind of a day-to-day thing, and just like filling my day with a lot of fear as well, a healthy amount of fear of what can I do to stay busy? What can I do to stay close to this sobriety? Because at that point I was too scared not only to be alone, but to go back to what I was doing before. I felt like I'd been given this opportunity where this problem of how am I going to get out of my childhood bedroom? How am I going to put my life back together? Well, that problem had been solved. I was now back in New York, and I was sober, and I was employed, and like maybe I was still scared, and maybe physically I was still kind of a wreck, and maybe I wasn't the happiest person in the world, but I was sober, And that's that year one was just like staying very close to this 12-step program, and being sober at that point was my entire life.
So were you living in the house the whole year?
Yeah.
So you lived there for a year.
Yeah.
You were doing 12-step meetings.
Yeah.
So you have camaraderie, you have fellowship, you kind of have a template for sobriety between the combination of therapy. So you're doing outpatient, well, you're living there, so it's kind of like outpatient, inpatient. What's it look like for you as you're getting toward the end of your stay?
My therapist at the time suggested that, I had 11 months sober and that maybe it was time for me to like look at moving out of the sober living, to which I responded, why would I want to do that? I've got my friends here, I feel comfortable here, but really I just didn't want to be alone, And then it also came, I gotta really like, figure out like a way to like make money, to like build some semblance of a career. And if I'm gonna like stay in New York, I gotta figure out like logistically how I'm going to do that, And, I had a lot of pride, because when I came in, it was 2017. A few years earlier, I was like traveling the world, like playing music. And I thought, well, I don't really want a job unless I can play music again. And that's who I am. I'm a musician, and I'm just actually in this transitional period. And, I don't really want work unless it's going to be I'm back on stage, right? And it was really humbling when I realized I had to like, just like find a job. And someone suggested like getting a real estate license, and it was the last thing I wanted to do, right? You know, I'm just not like
another real estate agent.
Right,
No,
it's just like this is like what you do, right?
Yeah,
when
right.
you're just like, this is like a job anyone could kind of do, right? And this is the job I took because this is like what was on the table, you know? And so then it became, you know, getting an apartment, getting a job, and figuring out how to like deal with this like waking up alone, and suddenly the light comes into the room, and I wake up and my eyes open and I'm sitting there and there's no external stimuli, and I'm alone with my own mind. And this is the same mind with the voices in my head. This is the same mind that tell me to order drugs in the dark web. This is, you know, the same mind that burned my life to the ground. And now I'm sitting here and I have to kind of reconcile with, well, that was me, but this is also me.
Right.
And that was the hardest part of like year 2 and 3 for me, you know. And I remember in this 12-step program, I had a sponsor, and he, you know, we had this was probably, you know, 2 or 3 years into being sober, and I looked at him and I said, hey man, like, I've worked the steps, I got a sponsor, I've got a sponsee, right? I got a home group, I'm going to meetings, I had service commitments, like I did all the things you told me to do. So now what? You know, I'm 30 years old, right? I have a job. I'm a couple years sober. So what happens now? What am I just like do this kind of ad infinitum until the rest of my life? Well, what's like the next thing I can read? What's the next thing I can do? He said, well, you kind of have some options here. You know, he's like, you can be a service on a greater level. You can, you know, get more sponsees. Right? You can deepen your spiritual practice. But I said, okay, fine. Well, maybe that's what I'll do. I started forcing myself to, you know, get up and meditate 10 minutes a day. And at the beginning, I kind of just sat there, and my mind would just be like a freaking hamster wheel. And it was really difficult. It's really difficult for me in general just to sit still. That is kind of the antithesis of what I am. I like to do, and I'm always on the go. To this day, it's difficult for me to like, you know, deal with this idea of unstructured time. But sure enough, I developed this kind of like loose concept of spirituality where it's nothing woo-woo or crazy. It's spirituality to me is being able to sit in this chair and just be okay and not need any sort of external stimulation to tell me who I am or what I should be doing, and just be able to reconcile with my mind and my body and to sit. And what I've realized is the quality of my existence isn't determined by the things around me, right? I got everything I wanted at a very young age, right? And I put the hardest drugs you possibly could into my body, right? And I did everything I could from the external to try and feel as good as possible. And what happened was my life just got worse and worse. And the quality of my human experience is determined by the relationship I have with myself. And that is what delving into some semblance of a spiritual practice. Now, what that looks like for me is meditation. What that looks like for me is breath work. What that looks like for me is having a morning routine, deliberate cold exposure, you know, sunlight in the morning, a non-negotiable routine, right? So that when I start my day at 10 a.m. and I have to, you know, run this company or be of use to other people, that I give myself the best possible foundation to exist on, right? Acceptance is really the key to everything for me today. It's like what I realize, you know, as the longer I stay sober, I have a bad day, okay, a good day, okay, I made money, okay, I lost money, okay, my friend had a baby, okay, I don't have kids, okay, right? Okay, right? Things are going to happen, right? And it's up to me to decide, how badly do I want them to rock my boat? Right? Because that is the only thing that is for sure, is that things are going to keep happening. That's just what it is to exist, right? And here I am, and I have to navigate these choppy waters. And oftentimes they're really choppy. As a small business owner, you know, it's chaos out there sometimes, right? And it's up to me to decide how I'm going to interpret that data, right? And so through this exploration of myself, and what that's also looked like is, you know, I've done silent meditation retreats. You know, I did an amazing one in the jungle of Oaxaca a few years ago, and I've just been kind of exploring. And this idea, it really just comes down to becoming more comfortable just being alone with myself. I don't feel the need to justify my value to you anymore. I don't need you to see me as the guy who had this job or played in this band or grew up in this place or had these parents or had this money. This is all external stuff, right? And I attach myself with it when I don't feel good, and I want you to see me in that way, right? But I don't feel the need to attach myself to that stuff anymore. I can show up to you baseline as me and feel congruent with myself. My actions feel congruent with who I am. This is where I feel I'm at today as a direct result of delving into spirituality a few years ago, right? And that suggestion from that sponsor, you know, as guidance to kind of further extend and my recovery, right? That was one of the most powerful conversations I've ever had, and it's really the most difficult thing I struggled with was just being alone with myself, and I don't feel that way. I don't see that as a problem anymore.
It's very interesting that you say that because I never got the vibe of you never had a lychee type vibe, you know? So, you know, and I say this out of respect because I can identify these characteristics of people in groups of people, but like, you know, sometimes when someone might be a newcomer,
right,
or just, you know, outside the world, you're like, why is this person gravitating toward me, like just standing by my side? Yeah, and you're like, oh, yeah. And then, you know, I've always, you know, especially as like the jocular guy in high school and everything, I always like threw my arm up with the guy, you know, I'd break his stones or, you know, whatever the situation was, but there was always like that love and appreciation.
Yeah, totally.
But you never really ever gave me that, while you were going through all this stuff, you never gave me that vibe. So it's interesting that you've navigated that the way that you have because it's because of your personality. But as you're out of these programs and you're in the real world and you're getting your license and you have a sponsor that's in a 12-step program, are you also seeking professional counseling, or do you have a therapist? Or
absolutely. Well, I always kind of described it as like spinning plates. Like the longer I stayed sober, the more I could balance. You know, that first year was literally just holding on and trying to stay sober.
Right.
And then it was like holding on and managing a job. And then it was like holding on, managing a job, and the idea of dating. And then it was holding on, managing a job, dating, and letting spirituality into the life. And then it was holding on, managing a job, you know, spirituality, dating, and like repairing my relationship with men. Right? And I slowly took on, over the past 7 years, like more onto my plate, right? And what that's looked like is I become, for lack of a better term, I become quite busy, which is where I really feel like I thrive. However, to, you know, continue to balance all these plates, like the one thing that's really kind of stuck out to me is this idea of like routine. And there are certain non-negotiables for me on a daily and weekly basis that give me like the best opportunity to be of maximum use to myself and other people. Because at the end of the day, like everything I do is to like set myself up so I feel good, I feel of maximum use to myself and others, and then I can move through life in an unimpeded manner. Like I feel like I can move without being kind of held up, whether it's by myself or what other people think of me or what I think other people think of me, right? And so what that's looked like is, yes, I have a therapist, right? I see this guy once a week, and that's been something that's new, like within the past year. I have a physical fitness program. I go to the gym 5 days a week. I'm super deliberate about what I eat, right? I'm deliberate about having a spiritual practice. I'm deliberate about going to a 12-step program. I'm deliberate about spending time with men, you know, for a while. I was scared of like being in groups of men. You know, I've kind of alluded to, I felt like I really had to kind of justify my seat at the table, or I wasn't quite sure what to say or what to do to get you to like me. What I realized is like the more sure I became of myself and who I was, I didn't have to have that fear anymore of do I belong here, or what do I say, or who am I, the more sure I became of my primary purpose. And the more I moved out of my own way and cleared out these concepts I had of who I was, or who I should be, or where I should be, or where I should be hanging out with, or who I should be living, and just existed as myself, the more comfortable I felt, especially around groups of men, right? So, you know, for me as someone who's has a ton of energy, right? I mean, the doctors would say hyperactive, right? I'm unmedicated. I don't take medication for my ADHD, and I honestly don't think about that diagnosis. I think it's just a term and a diagnosis, and the reality is the body and the mind I have are the one that I have, right? I don't have a choice over that. What I do have a choice over is how I play the cards in my hand, right? So as a result of someone who kind of has a lot of energy and has to channel it, dude, I eat the same things every day. I cook the same things every day. I go to sleep at the same time every day, right? I love to build things, and I love to create, right? This is like I feel fulfilled when I can sit with you and we can build something together, right? So this opportunity to build a business with my best friend and to watch this thing bloom and grow has been fantastic. But what I'll also say, it's allowed me the time and the flexibility to do the things I need to do to feel good baseline. Whether that's gym, whether that's travel, whether that's a spiritual practice, right? And so I'm super structured, I'm super regimented, calendar-based, to-do lists. Every day when I wake up, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I've got a list of 12 to 15 things, depending on what day it is. Everything's on my calendar. And that's how it works for me, man.
Where do you think that this level of accountability came from, right?
What I realized by a lot of trial and error is without like a clear framework, and by framework I mean knowing when and where I'm going to be somewhere, and knowing what I'm going to do on a daily basis, and having different practices as you talk about it, being spiritual or physical, that it's really easy for me to like sit in my apartment and kind of spin my wheels and look at my phone, or, you know, walk out the door and forget my keys, or, you know, not make use of a day, you know? And one thing I'll say about New York is like, it's tough to be here and then not do something, you know? Like, it's like you can, sure, you know, live in California, you can sit in your house for a day and you'll be fine, or go to the beach. But in New York, man, you sit in your house, you're gonna feel like you're doing nothing. And it's like, I knew I had to figure out a way to like exist in this city and like establish some sort of framework that would allow me to just like move easily through this like pipeline, right. You know? And dude, this isn't something that like happened overnight. This isn't something that happened over the course of like a year or two, right? This took like years of trial and error of how do I balance relationships, physical fitness, work, relationships with the family, friendship, you know, therapy. You know, how do I work on my relationships with men? And suddenly I realize it's not going to happen unless I write it down and plan it out. I can't just like, my business partner is amazing, but he can just like wake up and go and crush it, right? That's not who I am. Like, I need to know exactly where I'm going and what I'm doing and what time I'm going to be there and why I'm doing it, and if I feel good about myself and the motive behind doing that thing. And you know, this took a lot of trial and error, and it kind of goes back to the spinning plates thing. You know, it's just like taking on more as I can handle it.
Knowing your bandwidth.
Yeah, knowing my bandwidth, man. Absolutely.
Yep. And I think being honest, I think, you know, at least for myself, that accountability of surrounding myself with other people of like minds, even if we're not doing the same things, right? Yeah. We don't need to be doing the same things, but like, you know, that energy of saying, when is enough, right? I called you a couple days ago, and you know, I was in Miami, and I said, Dude, I had to take the afternoon off. Like coming back from Europe and then, you know, all this stuff, all this travel that I've had and work. I needed to take the afternoon to like not screw off, but go sit and listen to the ocean for 30 minutes, no cell phone, no nothing, and call another guy in sobriety.
Sure.
Right? I needed that. But the ability to recognize that is one of the gifts of being sober, right?
And self-aware, absolutely.
And self-awareness.
I'll say quickly on this, I was talking to an old college buddy the other day, and he is another like small business owner, and he's an app developer, and we came to the conclusion it's really great to talk to other entrepreneurs specifically because these are people who are getting thrown into the fire every single day, and they have to figure out how to get out because if they don't do it, no one else is going to do it. That's the thing when you own your own business or start a business, right? It's like you are constantly diffusing bombs every single day, and if you don't know how to do it, you better learn. Because if you don't learn, the thing's going to explode. And if you explode, then your partner's going to hate you, and your family's going to be like, "Where's that job that you had?" Right? And it's like that's why it's like so great. Like and as you said, to like be around like-minded folks. And you know, on a more macro level, I really do think like the greatest gift I've been given like in this life is being able to surround myself with other people who are on this journey and like fully taking advantage of like being alive and going after their thing. Because when I see someone else lit up about their thing, whatever their thing is, it could be being a sports talent agent, it could be being an app developer, it could be whatever it is, right?
A real estate agent.
Yeah, a real estate agent.
Yeah.
And listen, dude, there's a whole thing about that too, right? Like that lights me up, and then I want to learn, and then I want to read a book about it, and then I want to go to your meetings and hear about what you're talking about. And suddenly it's just like you build a network and you just like create this like hive mind of people who are going after their thing, music. I mean, that's the only way I got to experience this amazing thing going around the world. It was just like surrounding myself with people who were just like really authentically being themselves and going after it and being like, this is what I want to do. I can't control what happens. I can control what I put out there, and the market's going to decide what happens.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, being around people like that, man, I really feel like the rising tide lifting all ships, right? And I feel like that's been such a huge part of like, you know, success is all relative, but like why I feel full and successful today, you know?
That's awesome.
I was talking to my therapist like a few weeks ago, and he said, like, Charlie, you seem so concerned with like people seeing you as this guy who like pulled himself out of the rubble, you know, and like, you know, recovered from this horrific like drug addiction and pulled himself out of his parents' basement and this car crash, and you got this whole narrative. It's like this hero's journey kind of, you know, and he's like, and by the way, he's right. Like I love this like story that comes as a result of being in recovery, because if you stick around long enough, suddenly you've got this journey where you're like overcoming the odds, right? And you're up against this crazy thing, and you too, man. I mean, it's just like your story. But he was like, well, what are you without all that? It's like, what are you without all these stories you tell other people and yourself? Like, if you're not this guy who pulled himself out of the muck. I thought about it. So without like playing the music, right? Without getting sober, right? Without starting this company, without living in New York City and Los Angeles, all these things I identify with. I was just like, the Charlie today is like someone I'm proud of, you know? And it's someone where if someone asks me to show up somewhere on time, I know I'll be able to do that. If someone asks and says they need help moving, well, I can do that, right? If my mom says, you know, come home, my brother's in town, like this past weekend, I'll do that. Right? And it sounds so small and trivial, right? But that wasn't always the case. I wasn't the guy who could show up. I wasn't the guy who you'd call when you needed help. I wasn't the guy who would listen to you if you had a problem. I was the guy who called you if I needed something, right? And over the past 7.5 years, that whole thing has kind of been rewired, right? It's nothing to do with me. I mean, it has to do with me in the sense that I showed up.
Right.
Right? but it has to do with the people that helped me get here, right? And what it had to do with finally surrendering. Thanks for inviting me. You know, it was great to chop it up with you, dude. And I look forward to hearing everything else that's on this show, man. I'm really excited for you.